The title of today's show is Does Ukraine Equal Taiwan? And we were given that question by Joe Biden, who said that yes, China fooling around with Taiwan would be equal to Putin going into Ukraine. Now, this is a big question. It involves the entire world. Just think of the whole globe. Imagine that big globe. And how can you deal with it all? Well, you have to turn to JB West, Jeff Brown, and JB East, James Bradley. We're two guys with the same initials, both handsome, both exactly the same age. Two Americans who have been all over the world. Literally, I hitchhiked around the world when I was 21, been in 21 countries by the time I was 21. Jeff is still knocking off the dust from hitchhiking around Asia. Right now, I'm in New Zealand, and Jeff is out there in Normandy. We've got you covered in terms of looking at the whole world. So, Jeff, I'll ask you a question. What does that mean when Joe Biden says that Taiwan equals Ukraine?
I think it shows the sense of desperation of Western empires, Bretton Woods, world order, which has totally dominated and exploited most of the world's resources and humanity since World War II. Ukraine has completely blown up in the face of NATO, and Taiwan would also blow up in the face of the United States and Western Empire. But as we have seen throughout history, desperate empires do a lot of stupid things, and trying to maintain their hegemony and their control over their over their oppressed people. So it is frightening, James. You said it is frightening to think that the United States would even think about, would even give it a thought of trying to defend Taiwan, and that would pull in Japan, China, South Korea, North Korea, possibly Vietnam. I mean, it is a really, really, really scary situation.
Well, it's a scary situation that's being made pretty accessible and almost fun for the American public. I don't know if you saw it, Jeff, but on this Sunday's Meet the Press, they had, guess what? War games, the US versus China. And they war gamed it. They had a stadium box, a big box, like a sandbox, and then you could move ships, and there was Taiwan and China, and there was the US team and the China team, and they went through round one and then round two, and there was music, underneath it. So the American public is getting marinated in this idea of having a war. I mean, you could see it on Meet the Press, Jeff, and what's his name? Who's the pinhead who runs Meet the Press? You don't
I don't
you
know.
don't
I don't
know.
know that. I don't know.
I don't watch it, but I check in on the Sunday shows to see what they're selling. And he said the best case is a ground war in Taiwan. The worst case is nuclear. Now, folks, anyone been to Taiwan? I was there first time in 1974. My daughter lives there. I've been to Taiwan so many times. A ground war in Taiwan. I mean, if you stand up in Taiwan, you can almost see China. I lived on the islands between Taiwan and China, and you get that feeling, that you can almost touch China and Taiwan at the same time. And we would launch another Asian ground war 6,000 miles away. It's almost unthinkable. And then the worst case, he just shrugged. Chuck Todd is his name, and he just shrugged. Oh, the worst case would be nuclear. See you next week. Here's Pfizer. Here and then here's the Pfizer ad. Can can I can I yak on about Taiwan a little?
Oh,
And
absolutely,
I'll,
absolutely,
I'll
absolutely. This is wonderful.
Ukraine. So just it, I don't know where the reader or where the listeners are exactly, so it's hard to make a geographical reference. But I'm from Wisconsin, and then up above Wisconsin, in between Wisconsin and Canada, is the UP. It's called the Upper Peninsula, and it's the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So if you look at a map of Michigan, Michigan's kind of has this peninsula that it's cut off from. And the UPers, the uppers as we call them, feel independent, and they've often talked about secession. And there's secession stickers up there. Well, let's say that Canada had a big military, and then let's just choose a year, Canada slices off the UP, slices off the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and colors it in as Canada on the map. Well, do you think the people of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota would ever forget that? I mean,
No.
100 years later, 200 years later, they would be talking about the correct provenance of this thing called the Upper Peninsula. And I drag that out and make that so simple because that's how China sees Taiwan. A little history lesson to Chuck Todd, that America is presenting history as starting like right now. There's a Chinese plane flying over, and this is a democratic country, Taiwan, and we got to save it. And everything's right now, and there's no yesterday. And the Chinese, they have a history. We think back to George Washington. We write books about Thomas Jefferson, and they're bestsellers, and we marinate ourselves in that time. We have Williamsburg, where we rebuilt a colonial village. We think 200 years into the past. Why can't China? Well, if China thinks 200 years into its past, it thinks, well, Taiwan is Chinese. Everyone in the world knew that. It was under Chinese influence. No problem. And then after the Civil War, I'm taking you back to the 19th century. After the Civil War, there was a one-eyed American general, General Legendre, and he had one eye, and he was tall, and he became a consul in China, a minor consul. Well, General Legendre thought the neatest foreign policy thing in the world was the Monroe Doctrine and Andrew Jackson kicking out the Indians. So with Andrew Jackson, with the Trail of Tears, many people know the history. You cleaned out the Indians, and then you said, this is our territory. And the way you did it is by saying these people are less than us. So Legendre tells the Chinese, hey, you should militarily, conquer Taiwan because, you got to put your flag around it and draw all these lines like the West is drawing. And the Chinese laughed at him. Why do we need to do that? Everyone knows Taiwan is Chinese. Well, General Legendre is not kicked out of China, but he leaves China and he goes to Tokyo, and he becomes the first employee of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And he has private audiences with Emperor Meiji, who loves this guy. And soon in the newspapers, you see the Japanese words coroning, which is a Japan making the word colony. So they needed a colony, just like America. And in the 1870s, an American ship repainted as Japanese sailed to Taiwan and invaded Taiwan. That was the beginning of Japanese incursions, and Japan subsequently got control of Taiwan, used it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier in World War II. And then critically, after World War II, America had control of all these sea lanes. There was no China, the listener has to remember. There was no China. China was in a civil war. Mao and Chiang Kai-shek were duking it out. And the Americans, not to criticize them, they owned the Pacific, and they drew lines. This is where Japan ends, and this is where China ends, and the Philippines. And they drew all these lines on the maps of the Pacific when there was no China. Well, Chiang Kai-shek lost. The Chinese people went to Mao. Mao got the mandate of heaven. And America kind of really, illegally, not playing the game straight, took the loser of the Chinese Revolution and put him on Taiwan. And folks, I don't know how old you are. I'm 68. When I was in high school, I was taught that, see, there's this huge red mass on the map. That's red China. We don't talk to them. That's not the real China. They're not real Chinese, those 500 million at that time. But the real Chinese are on this little island here. This is China. And I was taught that in school. Oh, this is the real China on this little island, you know? Oh my God. And it sounds crazy, but that was true for many years. So folks, all this talk of invasion of Taiwan, the Chinese don't see it that way. And I'm not arguing for their case. I'm just saying historically, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is part of the United States. It's part of Michigan. And Taiwan is part of China. And in the recent history, it got dressed up as something else. But we have to stop fooling ourselves. And just like East and West Germany united, just like Korea, North and South can unite and they can work it out. China and Taiwan can work it out. They already have so many cross-border relationships. And but in American TV, it's only presented as aggressive. So I asked my daughter who lives in Taipei, gee, what happens if China takes over Taiwan? And she kind of sighed like it was boring. And she said, well, I guess I'll have a different color passport. So that's my little, we have to realize if we're going to engage someone in the Pacific, we have to understand the history of the Pacific.
Well, not only that, but it's not just since World War II or even the 19th century. The China and Taiwan has been a part of the Chinese nation, maybe not as a nation state, but as part of the Chinese nation going back thousands of years. And and to think that this little tiny island, which is the size of Maryland in the United States or the Netherlands in Europe, and has 23 million people compared to 1.4 billion in mainland China, and Taiwan would be the sixth largest province of China in terms of GDP. It's an important economy, but it's just nothing compared to mainland China. And what a lot of people don't realize is that it only has 23 million people. I mean, that's not even as big as Shanghai or Beijing or Chongqing or Guangdong. Taiwan is not even as big as China's four biggest cities. Not only that, but 5%, a million Taiwanese live on mainland China, and they're not washing dishes and driving taxis. These are CEOs, these are business owners, factory owners, managing directors, scientists, engineers, high level, highly educated people. There's a million Taiwanese living and working in mainland China. It is just like for the United States and everybody else. It is the manufacturing motor for Taiwan's economy. And I like to joke that all China has to do is just cancel about 10 or 20,000 visas and send all those managing directors and factory owners and CEOs and presidents of companies back, just send them home, and it would literally bring Taiwan to its knees because the economy would implode without all of that, as you said, it's like an umbilical cord between Taiwan. It's only 2,000 kilometers away. And it's just it's like an umbilical cord, economic, social, historical, cultural. They speak Mandarin, just like the Chinese do. So it's just, yeah. And then you describe this thing like on Meet the Press. It's just unbelievable. I mean, does Chuck Todd know that the supply line from Los Angeles to Taipei is 11,000 kilometers? How are they
No,
going to?
no, no, but that's what I mean. It's the type. Your aperture of your camera is very wide as you speak. Just take it in tight. There's the war games. There's the sandbox. Boo, 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 boo. There. No, but there's no comprehension that just what China's got 1.5 billion people, and they're right next to Taiwan. And it isn't that we just have to give up. I think it's our thinking. I went to school in Japan in 1974. And when I saw Biden go to Korea and Japan on this trip, it was like, wow, it's 1978 all over again. There's no China. You know what I mean? There's just this poor China that isn't a player. And then America goes to its puppets, Japan and South Korea, and kind of salutes the troops. I mean, the American military runs those countries. But just, wake up. Japan, the average age of the Japanese right now is like 104. I admire the Japanese, but there's not many of them, number one. And number two, they were trained by the American military. What is the American military's record in training lately? Let's see, they trained the South Vietnamese army. They trained the Afghan army. They trained the Iraqi. How'd that work out? Every army that America has trained has had some problems. But we got this old talk. The Pacific Command has now become the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
And they want to build an Indo-Pacific NATO. And I'll close my little part here by recalling Secretary of State Blinken yesterday gave a speech to the Asia Society, and Kevin Rudd, the former what was he? What do you
Prime
say?
Minister of Australia.
Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd,
Conservative.
Looking real ruddy, gets up there to welcome Blinken. And he opens up by saying, how important the US-China relationship is, not just to the US and China, but to the whole world. And listen to this. The future of the Pacific will depend upon, quote, US policies and China's response to them. So right there, stop the speech. I mean, you guys are off on the wrong foot. America makes the policies, this one world order, the stabilities of blah, 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 all the words that they use. Kevin Rudd is saying the future is American policies and China response. If China would just lie down and let us mow over them, you know what I mean? US policies and Chinese response. They got to wake up. It's 2022. We can sit at the table and admit that some of these lines we drew in 1945, don't make sense now that there's a real China at the table.
Well, that's for sure. And then you've got, as you talk about the Indo-Pacific, the wild card of, India right now, who has always very artfully, like to play the middle game because they have a very competitive relationship with China. They're very close with Russia, the USSR previously, but they also want to, I gagged a maggot when I saw that picture when they had the meeting with with the new Albanese, the new Prime Minister of Australia, and India, Modi, and was it Biden or was it Blinken? I don't remember who was there. And then
Biden with they were
yeah,
both
well, they were both there, and then the Prime Minister of Japan. I mean, it's just it's a very, very contentious region of the world. It's got 50% of the world GDP. It's got 30% of the world's population, all in that small area there in Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia. And the United States can do nothing but try to destroy its enemies, and its biggest enemy in Asia, of course, is China. And as you said, America lost against the North Koreans and the Chinese in the Korean War, who were using World War II and World War I vintage arms, had no navy, limited air support from the Soviet Union, and they lost. The Americans lost in Korea, another U.S. trained army in South Korea, and now you have Russia, which has probably the best military in the world. You have China, which probably has the second best military in the world, because ships aren't painted. Ships don't work in the United States. Submarines are decommissioned. The F-35 can't fly. They don't have hypermissiles. The United States, Russia has hypermissiles. China has hypermissiles. North Korea has hypermissiles, and the U.S. has no hypermissiles. The idea, plus the fact that both Russia and especially China have important navy presence in the Pacific. China's navy would overwhelm Taiwan in 1 week with the massive navy that they have built up since the 1980s. So it's just, I don't know, James. It's just frightening to think that the United States and its allies, with their reptile brains, they think like lizards, and they have no concept of maybe stepping back and, as you said, read a history book and look at the forest from the trees. They're just totally focused on total domination, and they accept nothing less.
Well, I think they're winning too, because if you can simplify the message, McDonald's is your kind of place. The Coke, the drink that refreshes. I mean, Taiwan equals Ukraine, and that's the president of the United States, and it's simple and it's graspable, and the press is running with it. There's only this recent history, and I'm not talking about. See, for me, there should be no conflict in the Taiwan situation. That it's a long lost brother province of the Chinese. Let them reunite. There'll be a little friction, but just let it happen, like East and West Germany. It's just a historical thing. And then there need not be war in the Pacific. China doesn't need to, up its navy and have a lot of guys killed, because it's an undoable task. But I don't want to argue it militarily. I want to say it's a task that doesn't need doing. It's a false equivalency that Ukraine equals Taiwan. But Jeff, you're out there in Europe. What about Ukraine equaling? What does Ukraine equal these days?
Well, Ukraine is simply a proxy war NATO, Australia, New Zealand, or what I like to call your Anglo land, and more, including Israel, who's sending mercenaries to Ukraine. It's a proxy war between between Western Empire and the multipolar world, because Ukraine is essentially it affects Iran, it affects China, it is affecting Africa, it is affecting the Middle East, it is affecting economies all over the world. So this, for me, and I know people don't like it when I bring this up, because capitalism is kind of like the Bible; you can't question it. But to me, this is the last. Ukraine is the tipping point. Ukraine is the last gasp of the wounded of the wounded hyena, the Western capitalism. It's run its course. They cannot exploit the resources and enslave the people of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Bolivia, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. All these countries are saying, even the Philippines, the new president Marcos is
Bong bong.
yeah, Bong Bong. He's picking up the baton from Duterte. We are going to align with China. So all these countries are just basically we Bretton Woods has run its course. It's running out of gas. It has tens and tens and tens and tens of trillions of dollars of debt that will never be paid back. And as you said, the United States couldn't take on Mao, and they're definitely not going to take on Xi today. And the United States couldn't take on Stalin and Khrushchev, and they're definitely not going to take on Putin today. It's just Ukraine is it. I mean, what scares me is that it's over. Russia has won. They just took over Liman yesterday. They're about to surround and choke off 15,000 of Ukraine's elite soldiers in Savantdorsk. It's a big area next to the Donetsk. They have Mariupol. They will move on over to Odessa, and then they're just piling weapons that are being blown up by Russian missiles. What is the West going to do? They're going to lose Ukraine. I don't think Russia has any choice but to go all the way to the borders of Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania and Moldova, because otherwise they will continue to pour billions and billions of dollars of arms into Ukraine to try to destroy Russia in order to destroy later China. So yeah, this is World War III. This is World War III stuff. I think I just saw somebody was saying, I just saw a headline before we connected, who was saying that this is, it was actually on Covert Action magazine. Somebody was saying that this is like a 1914 World War I moment, where the world traipses into ass backwards into World War. And it's all being driven by the United States, NATO, global capitalism, and their need to exploit and enslave the world's resources. Otherwise, it can't work. So Lenin, Stalin, Marx, Mao all said, capitalism can't survive without war, and we're seeing it right now.
But is it not to challenge the capitalism thing at all? But isn't it empire? I mean, it is
Yeah, yeah,
it is the fall of a capitalistic empire. But it's really empire is the father of all this, reaching
yeah,
out around the world.
yeah.
To give it a little Pacific look, I'm in New Zealand, and the Australians, I'm sorry to say, at least on the media regarding China, are absolutely crazy. There's a former defense minister called Peter Dutton, and he goes on TV, and we have to rearm. Australia is going to jump into the fight if America, there's any fight between China and America, Australia is going to jump in and help our ally. And he talks like it's World War II. They're going to put on these boots and they're going to wade ashore. And I mean, there's 25 million people in Australia. There's 1.5 in, let's look at the geography. So Korea and Japan are going to fight with America if there's a world war. Really? Is that so? There's 50,000 American troops on Okinawa. In a nuclear war, what they would have like a 6-minute lifespan, they'd be toast. Those troops we have in Korea are right next to China. They could throw nuclear bombs like baseballs into Korea.
So could North
and
Korea.
and so good North Korea. But I mean, why are these nations going to fight for the U.S. with Taiwan? They're already doing business with Taiwan.
Yeah.
If the U.S. would step back, there's tremendous intercourse between all the countries of the Pacific and Taiwan. Things are okay. They don't, I mean, war's not needed. But if it is, we keep talking about our allies in the Indo-Pacific. India's going to fight China. There's been a few fistfights between India and China, but India and China don't want to go to war. Japan going to war, that's really the U.S. Marines going to war. We've got the troops in Japan. Same thing with Korea. Where's this help? We can't even get our ports open on the West Coast. I'm not criticizing America. I'm just trying to say to, anyone listening to this war talk and these war games about fighting China, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
It starts out as ridiculous and it's not worth talking about. And then I back up and say, what's the problem? And the problem is a word salad of sovereignty and democracy and freedom and all this stuff that has just gotten a lot of people killed with American ammunition over the decades.
Well, and as you said, it's not going to work with China, but it's too late in Ukraine because the NATO has jumped in head first, and they're going to lose. They've already lost.
They've already lost.
Yes, they've already lost.
But but senators are still saying on TV, they've got a fighting chance, and we're behind them, and they're misleading the American people.
Yeah, I predict that Russia will have no choice but to reintegrate all of Ukraine up to the borders of the EU with Poland, because Poland is Poland is sort of the Dutton of the Dutton of NATO. They're the attack dog, the regional
Right.
the regional Rottweiler for Western Poland is absolutely insane, and the Russians are gonna have to line the border of Europe, of the European Union, with elite tank divisions to keep these deranged Dr. No, I mean, it's like it's like insane people are governing in the West, and or at least the people behind them. All the people behind Biden. These people are insane. So it's like Dr. No. It's just unbelievable. And so anyway, it's very, very scary. And you're far away, James. I'm in France. If there was a war, my daughter and my wife and I were going to be in the middle of it. You're in far off New Zealand, so I can write you letters about what it's like to be in a war.
Well, Charles Nenner is a Dutch cycles guy, and he studied war cycles like 3000 BC and back to the early Chinese empires and whatever. And he says the cycle looks like big war next year. Martin Armstrong, other people say the same thing, and he estimates 2 billion deaths. So maybe we are moving. I mean, we're at war. People are dying right now. American ammunition is out there on the field against Russia. That's about as big as you can get.
Yeah.
And it's pretty brittle talking. The president's saying, yes, we'll militarily, get involved in Taiwan. So that's right now, I think, as we sign off, we have to say it's about as hot as it can possibly be without, having a bigger war in Ukraine and a new war with China.
Absolutely. Fingers crossed, and hopefully something will keep all of these predictions from Armstrong and Nenner from coming true. But it's just I think what's going to happen in the next. It'll just be in the next when it's obvious that Ukraine is lost, just like Korea was lost, just like Vietnam was lost, just like Afghanistan was lost, just like Iraq was lost, just like Iran was lost, just like Syria is lost, just like Libya was, destroyed and lost. What's going to happen when it occurs to the American people and the European people that they have been used, abused, insulted by their leadership and by their military industrial complex, impoverished. Are they going to trigger war, or are they going to back off and try to put things back together again? We'll see. But as you say, historically it's not very promising with the reptile-brained leadership in the West.
Well, who knows? But we're watching the world for everybody. I'm JB East, James Bradley, signing off to Jeff Brown, JB West in Normandy.
Thanks, James. Bye-bye.
Okay, see you.
Bye-bye.